And welcome back, everybody, to another episode of 10 Minute Theology. We've been talking about angels for, wow, quite a while now. 9 weeks. This will be part 10 on angels. Introduction to fallen angels and demons is what we're going to talk about today. So let's go ahead and jump into the content, and we'll see what we have for you here today. So, introduction to fallen angels and demons. Fascinating subject. Deserves its own subsection as we talked about angels. So let's go ahead and jump in. First to mention, and we mentioned this before when we started angels as a whole, we have to remember the spirit world is real. And you say, okay, great, yeah, we got that. Why do you bring that up again? Well, so check this out. This is interesting as we look at this survey. This is a Gallup poll that was taken is in 2023, I believe, May. I've got the link for you down there if you want to follow that and take a look at the details of it. I couldn't find exactly how many people they polled, but regardless of that, check this out. So it was nice because it broke it down. I tried to find a Barna poll. If you're familiar with church surveys, the Barna group does a lot of surveys of church membership, church-going people, but this broke it down, at least this Gallup poll broke it down by the religious service attendance, which I thought was important. So of the people who attended weekly, interesting here, 98% of them believe in God. That's good. It's like, wow, if not, then I'm not sure why they're going there. Look at that, though, as you go to the right. 94% believe in angels. Go to the far right now. Of those people, again, we're talking about the weekly attenders, 86% believe in the devil. So it's interesting that 94% believe in angels, but only 86% believe in Satan. As you drop down, you go to nearly weekly or monthly attendance. 94% believe in God, 90% believe in angels, 77% believe in Satan. Go down to less often now of nearly weekly / monthly. So obviously just casual attenders. Only 57% of them believe in God. 52% of them believe in angels, and 40% of them believe in Satan. So you can see as the attendance goes down, clearly their commitment and their dedication to God wanes, and it just shows that it's not as significant. And in addition to that, it would be their dedication to the scriptures as well. But it's interesting that even in the weekly attenders, 86% believe in the devil. So you've got a 14% of them that do not. So kind of interesting there. It's broken down as well by religion. You can check out Protestant or other Christian, break down a Catholic. Interesting when you look at the Catholic one, 80% believe in angels, what I would expect for that to be fairly high, but only 60% believe in the devil or Satan, right? So enough of that is just kind of interesting, and it's worthy of bringing up, right, that people forget that the spirit world is real, and the biblically based spirit world, more importantly, is absolutely real, and this shows how people think about it. So let's move on, but it just gives you some context on why I bring that up again. So the Bible speaks of fallen angels, Satan, and demons. So that's important to remember, kind of three categories as we look at that. Some people will think that this is kind of mysterious as we get into the details of this more in the future weeks. It should be remembered different interpretations do exist. Now, I throw that out there, not saying that we can't possibly understand what the Bible is trying to communicate, but you've got to remember that different interpretations do exist among Christian churches, and the more literal that a church denomination takes the Word of God, the more literally they are going to believe these facts. So angels are real, Satan is real, the demons are real, all of that stuff, right, as we talk about the spirit world. And think about as well that as you think about eschatology, which is the study of the end times, even though we say that, hey, it should remember a lot of different interpretations exist, a lot of them exist for that as well. And we'll talk a little bit more about that too as I progress here, just as an example. Also for sticking with biblical references, okay, that's going to be our clearly our primary source, right? It's a biblically based ministry. We believe the Bible is the inspired word of God, and that is always our primary source. Okay. With that being said, we will discuss some extra biblical texts as well. You should be remembered that extra biblical texts are not inspired. It would be like going to today's library or even a theological library, right? You are going to have a lot of theological texts independent of the Word of God itself, the actual Bible that sits in there. Think of your commentaries. Sure, they have a lot of biblical-based information in them, but they're going to have a lot of extra biblical information as well. Historical accounts, cultural things as well that help you understand the text more in terms of what was going on there. And we'll do that same thing with this. So when I talk about extra biblical texts, some of the ones that we'll hit, a very popular one, at least one that's common that you may have heard of, the Book of Enoch. The Book of Enoch really focuses on what's called the Watchers. So you'll hear about that. And interesting to know as well that the Watchers are also mentioned within the Bible itself. So we'll talk about that as we get to the subject. The Book of Jubilees you may not have heard of. It's also referred to as the Little Genesis. The Book of Giants was also found within the midst of the Dead Sea Scrolls. A lot of people think the Dead Sea Scrolls were just biblical texts. They are not. There was a lot of other texts of the time, of that era, that existed within them too. And then, believe it or not, Josephus. We'll go to him to get his... There's some information within Josephus where he talks about that, hey, giants were real, and has some information to say about that. So just to give you a little idea of what I'll talk about as we salt some of that stuff in to this study, it would be like, again, going to one of today's modern libraries and taking some extra biblical text to see how do people at the time think about these different things. Let's move on. Okay, so fallen angels once served God, but they chose to rebel, clearly, right? So that's good to remember. We'll talk about, are demons the same as fallen angels? Again, as I mentioned, a lot of people would think no, but I tell you, a lot of people think that, I should say more people think no than think yes, that they are the same. I think the text is overwhelming that they are different, so I'll just give you my view right up front. But again, a common view is that demons are fallen angels. I don't think that's the case, and we'll get into that, and I'll present my argument for it from a conservative biblical standpoint as well. And again, as you think about this, and get away from the Nephilim here for just a second, but as you think about the common view that demons are fallen angels, again, as you go back to eschatology and start thinking about that, a lot of people would not believe today that there is going to be a true rapture of the church, that there's a literal 7-year tribulation coming up, and a literal return of Christ with a literal 1,000-year millennium after that. So predominantly, the end times view within the Protestant church does not go towards those literal interpretations of eschatological events, so end times events. But I just bring that up because that's very common as you get to more mainstream churches that have less of a hardcore literal biblical view. You'll start to get less of an adaptation and adherence to the Word of God itself. Okay, others say that demons are the spirits of the Nephilim. If you've never heard the term Nephilim, go check out Genesis chapter 6, and it talks about the Nephilim. And actually, all throughout the Old Testament and other places, there's offspring of the Nephilim, and we'll talk about what those are and what that means. So that is a whole lot of information. We'll have to dive into that in its own episode as we progress throughout this study. Okay, let's hit a key passage here as we continue to think about this. In Revelation 12, verses 7 through 9. So let's take a look at this. And there was war in heaven, Michael and his angels waging war with the dragon. The dragon and his angels waged war, and they were not strong enough, and there was no longer a place found for them in heaven. And the great dragon was thrown down, that serpent of old who is called the devil and Satan, who deceives the whole world. He was thrown down to the earth, and his angels were thrown down with him. So this is a key verse where you get the concept that Satan took angels with him out of heaven when he rebelled. Key verse for that in Revelation. We'll talk about the timing of that when we get to it as well. Another key passage, Luke 10, 17 to 20. And this is after he had sent out the 70. So he sent out the 70 to go basically evangelize for him. And when they came back, starting here in verse 17. The 70 returned with joy, saying, Lord, even the demons are subject to us in your name. And he said to them, I was watching Satan fall from heaven like lightning. Behold, I have given you authority to tread on serpents and scorpions, and over the power of the enemy, and nothing will injure you. Nevertheless, do not rejoice in this, that the spirits are subject to you, but rejoice that your names are recorded in heaven. So another key verse here, right, that Jesus himself talks about Satan, mentions Satan, and we'll go into that as we get to our study on Satan. But it's funny here because he's pointing it out to him. He's like, you guys don't really get who I am, do you, right? But I was there when Satan fell. You wonder if they were kind of scratching their heads after he said that. Okay, let's keep progressing along. Speaking about Satan, we'll talk about his origin and the demise of Satan, what's going to happen to him in the future. The different names given to Satan. I'll give you a hint. Satan and the devil, the dragon, as we mentioned there in Revelation 12. All names given to Satan, they all have special meanings to them. Especially in the Old Testament, when you look at names of Satan, it's important to remember that names were very critical back then, and people gave their children names based upon things that were going on at the time. So names are very important and can be very descriptive and give you attributes of those people. We'll talk about the activity of Satan. And boy, we'll mention Satan at the temptation also, that incredible view we have of Jesus Christ talking with Satan during the temptation, both found in Matthew 4 and also Luke chapter 4. So we'll dive into that and talk a little bit about more about that in detail. And speaking of fallen angels and demons, are they the same? Again, their origin and demise, we'll go through that as well. The activities of fallen angels and demons, as I kept mentioning as we were going in each episode of angels, what was the purpose of angels? In fact, I titled them The Purpose of Angels, right? They're there to both worship, praise, and serve God. So if that was which serving God included serving us at the direction of God. If that was the purpose of angels who did not fall, guess what? The activities of the fallen angels and the demons are absolutely the opposite. They are not there to worship God. They are not to serve God, and they are definitely not there to serve us. In fact, they're there to act in contrary to us, to try to hinder us, which by default then they think can hinder God's plan and therefore not attribute to worshiping God. But we'll talk about all that as we progress. What about demon possession? Is it real? We read about it in the New Testament quite a bit. Does it occur today? Interesting that throughout the whole Old Testament, you don't find any example of a demon being cast out. Pretty interesting. In fact, the word demon only occurs in the English text 3 times within the Old Testament, whereas it occurs 89 times within the New Testament. So you can see the dichotomy between the Old and the New in terms of at least talking about demons. And we'll talk about allusions to fallen angels and demons. We'll talk about why are no demons cast out in the Old Testament, as I just mentioned, right? So, and when I say allusions to fallen angels and demons, there are mentions of it, and there's a fascinating resource. It's called the Dictionary of Deities and Demons of the Bible. It's in my sources at the end of this video. So as you watch through the sources, you'll see I've added a bunch of different ones for this series. And take a look at it because there's just some fascinating stuff. Also the Michael Heiser stuff, as I mentioned in my previous one, on the day of the Lord. On the angel of the Lord. He goes into a lot of the spirit world stuff as well. And there's a couple resources in there from him that I highly recommend. But again, allusions to fallen angels or demons, believe it or not, there's the very possibility, there's pretty strong allusion to it, that there were demons present at the crucifixion of Christ, observing what was going on. Pretty interesting to see as you start to dig into that, but there's definitely some references to it in the Old Testament. Okay, what about the influence on Christian? What can fallen angels and demons do to the Christians? Can a Christian be demon possessed? It's a common question that people get. Can Christians be influenced by demons? And how about this? Does all sin start with demonic influence? You hear people say, the common phrase in vernacular talk, the devil made me do it. Okay, the devil made you do something bad. Does the devil make you do every bad thing that you do? We're going to talk about that. That'll look a little bit at the origin of sin and the sinful flesh nature that each one of us has as well. But again, we're going to talk about what demonic influence has there too. Can Christians cast out demons today? We'll talk about that some. And then also, how about this? Can demons read our mind? That's a topic that comes up. I've heard that in church Bible studies before. People want to know, can demons read our minds? We'll talk about what biblical evidence may or may not be there to indicate whether they can or cannot. Okay, and last but not least, some fringe subjects, right? The gap theory in Genesis chapter 1, if you haven't heard about that, believe it or not, some people believe between Genesis 1:1 and Genesis 1:2, there's a gap. And in that gap is when the fall of Satan occurred. And actually, Genesis 1:2 is a recreation of what was created in Genesis 1:1. Just throwing it out there. We'll dig into it in a little more detail. But I bring that up because it has to do with fallen angels and demons. And how about this? Are aliens and ancient aliens really demons? And, I bring this up, and I don't want to get too fringy and too off course, but yet there's a lot of things going on within the world today. A lot of news cycle about, the possibility of aliens. In fact, even there's been debate in the U.S. government now and discussion over it where they're coming out and saying that, hey, there's alien spacecraft that exist. If you go look at all those hearings, it's kind of interesting. But still, it's like, is this a big setup? Is it really demons that are pretending to be aliens? I'm kind of giving away my position on that, but my argument would be yes. We'll talk about that a little more. And what about all the earthen mounds and the ancient monuments? Here in central Ohio, you can go out east a little bit, out the Newark way, a big earthen mound out there. If you go down southeast in Ohio, a huge serpent mound that is astronomically aligned in some interesting ways as well. And above and beyond that, what about Stonehenge? What about the pyramids? Was that demonic activity that created these, or is that just signs of an ancient race and ancient intelligence that we're just not aware of? But it's worth bringing up because it's in the news cycle out there and it exists in our world today. And a lot of people will equate it to demonic activity and things like that. And we'll talk about that as well as we mentioned it. Okay, that'll bring us to the end. That gives you at least a preview of what we're going to be going through here in the future weeks as we march into our series on fallen angels and demons. So I hope you at least enjoyed the preview. And like I said, as we get into it further, you will start to see that, hey, how all this topic unfolds. And again, a lot of information on it. And you find that a lot of Christians just don't have a lot of actual biblical information on the spirit world from this aspect. So I hope you have a great week. I hope you're doing well. God bless you all, and we will see you next time. Take care, everybody.